Good morning, good afternoon, good night. I am Desireé López de Maturana, OMEP Vice President for Latin America, and I have the honor and joy of coordinating this second seminar on early childhood care and education.
This webinar has interpretation in English and French, and it's transmitted in the OMEP World TV YouTube channel, where you will have access to all the presentations and webinars in the 3 official languages of OMEP, which are English, French, and Spanish. I give a warm greeting and welcome to all of the OMEP members, friends, and partners who from all over the world come together to reflect upon the topics that gather all of us in this webinar. We welcome with great warmth our speakers, Dr. Carlos Calvo Muñoz, permanent collaborator of OMEP, and Roberto Rocha, Vice President of OMEP Brazil, and our dear Mercedes Mayol Lassalle, OMEP World President and main creator of these webinars. Welcome to all of you. No doubt the pandemic has made us postpone our world conferences, but it didn't prevent us from continuing with our debates and political and pedagogical discussions that strengthen our community, and our synergic actions allow us to develop our goals with the 2030 agenda, in particular what is mentioned in targets 4.2 and 4.7, highlighting the quality of education and care in early childhood and education for sustainable development, human rights, gender equality, and global citizenship, respectively. In this context, the OMEP World Committee created a series of webinars to be done this year and the next to share perspectives and experiences that reflect the diversity, knowledge, and richness of the policies around pedagogy around the world regarding early childhood, and where children have been affected by the social and economic consequences of the pandemic. The first webinar was done on August 23rd on this topic, right from the start, and the advocacy work on early childhood. And to begin with our topic for today, called Pedagogy as a Practice of Liberation, in acknowledgement of the 100 years of the birth of the great teacher Paulo Freire, and we borrowed the title of the book that talks about his story, and to present the speakers who have a vast experience on children and Paulo Freire's pedagogy, I give the floor now to Mercedes Mayol. Mercedes Mayol Lassalle is a world president of OMEP, the World Organization of Early Childhood Education, as from January 1st, 2020. She is a national normal teacher, Bachelor of Science in Education from the University of Buenos Aires. She was a former director of the early childhood education of the city of Buenos Aires. She is currently a professor of the master's degree in early childhood education at the University of Buenos Aires and of the regional training program in planning and management of educational programs of UNESCO Buenos Aires Office for Latin America. She is an elected member of the Coordination Group of Collective Consultation of NGOs on Education 2030. I give the floor now then to Mercedes Mayol Lassalle. Hello everyone, good afternoon. It's an honor and pleasure to me to be a part of this webinar and to be around all our colleagues from all around Latin America, whom I appreciate and acknowledge for their commitment, ethical posture, and vast knowledge. Thank you, Desireé, López de Maturana, Carlos Calvo, and Roberto Mauro Gurgel Rocha for participating today and to enrich this series of webinars that we have planned for this year and the next. I also appreciate the support of our colleagues from the OMEP community from all around the world who are here today in spite of the time differences and have come to share this conversation on Paulo Freire's legacy and its actual importance. One of the fundamental areas of work in OMEP is political advocacy. These webinars enable the reflection on the different aspects of the strategic plan at OMEP. They help to build meaning in the action and the inter- and intra-regional articulations. They strengthen the vision within each member and each national committee, and I hope that they will be an opportunity for us to enable a space of exchange of ideas to define our emblematic initiative, A Decade for Early Childhood Education and Care. As we stated in the title, pedagogy is a political practice. This conviction was first stated by Paulo Freire and shared with other intellectuals and educators from all around the world through his great practice and vast work. Paulo Freire was born on September 19, 1921 in Recife, in the northeast of Brazil. So, a few days ago marked the 100th anniversary of his birth. His thought was in great relationship and dialogue with his time philosophers, pedagogists, and activists from his generation that many of us have known and studied, such as Ivan Illich, Michel Foucault, Henri Giroux, Stephen Kemis, Jürgen Habermas, Loris Malaguzzi, Gianni Rodari, and so many others. His work is well known all around the world and transcends a method of literacy to state as a political, pedagogical, ethic, and aesthetic proposal for education that is clearly current today and helps us to tackle the challenges of today. Freire showed us with great clarity that the practice of education is not neutral and cannot be neutral. The actions, methods, goals always obey a vision of the human being and a type of society for which we work. If education then is not neutral, it serves a political function. And if we understand by politics the human need of putting ourselves in the historical process of a local context, that is the place where we practice education, where we live, and from where we think the global context, then it is imperative to have an active political attitude and awareness. Politics is not necessarily related to a specific political party, but rather it is about the meaning where we manage education, we select educative content, we practice teaching and learning, we establish relationships among adults, kids, literates and illiterates, the patrons and workers, governors and the people. All of these social relationships are a part of political life. These relationships are ambiguous, conflictive, and that they can also lead to dependency, submission, oppression, exploitation, and ultimately exclusion. Paulo Freire was one of the greatest builders of the critical pedagogy, a pedagogy that is liberating, transformative, democratic, and building of citizenship. But ethics always comes before pedagogy, and for this reason he stated that education is an ethical project of life. A few days ago, the general coordinator of 𝗣𝗲𝗏𝗏, our dear colleague 𝗍𝗲 Lizarazo, said, and I agree, that Paulo Freire's thought is the foundation of all our organization and the activist ideas for which we work regarding the human right to education. OMEP is a part of this global movement highlighting the right to education and care in early childhood and acknowledging that young children are entitled to their rights and are citizens from birth. Freire was an enormous referent in the debates and struggles since the end of the 60s in the 20th century, and he was crossed by big social, educative, and political conflicts. Let's bear in mind that his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, that I read for the first time in 1970 when I first started university to study the bachelor's degree in science of education, was published in 1968 for the first time, and it was contemporary to May 68 in France, the movement for civil rights in the United States, the Spring in Prague, the 𝗣𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 in Argentina, the theology of liberation, and so many other processes, very heavy social and political processes from that time. Of course, education and school systems were also being questioned because of their rigidity and their function to maintain inequality and social and economic exclusion. For this reason, Paulo Freire's thought started to develop in that historical context and was founded in that strong pedagogy and ethical practice that he developed. For this reason, it is still current today, and it's still a reference for us to understand the current crisis and debates. As you know, OMEP participates together with other civil society organizations in the realization of the agenda for the Sustainable Development Goals within the United Nations and UNESCO, as well as at national and local levels for the monitoring of the building of meanings and a pathway for the 2030 education agenda. In this agenda, we define the goal to achieve an inclusive, equitable, and quality education for all. We are also involved not only in these processes, but in other goals that go beyond 2030. For example, the UNESCO initiative, Future of Education. In these forums, we permanently find ourselves in the midst of tensions and disputes between two paradigms. One that is founded in neoliberalism, in the market, in profit individualism, and the other one founded in human rights, solidarity, life, and care, the ethics of care, of course, in justice and equality. These tensions have been highlighted and strengthened by this crisis provoked by the COVID-19 pandemic. And please, let's bear in mind, in these so-called recipes for plans of recovery, the humanist and critical thought of Paulo Freire helps us and is going to help us to back up our postures, because it's based on ethics, critical thinking, humanism, the defense of democracy, the participation, and a pedagogy of hope that ultimately trusts in the possibility that all human beings can learn and change the world. As 𝗍𝗶𝗿𝗏𝗏 said just in a webinar just a few days ago, Paulo Freire's proposal is transcendent because it is a philosophy on education, and it is also an epistemology to understand and to be in this world. Paulo Freire's thoughts invite us to approach this possible unknown. This first point of the Educational Act is the context and the critical situation that can be in an economic and political context with great social and cultural implication. The analysis of the context is necessary for us to transform ourselves and to be capable of discovering these situations and to struggle to overcome these limits. And in the last chance to build these possible unknowns. This concept englobes a hope of transformation, and with this Freire sets his expectation and reaffirms that the education of the oppressed implies a process of awareness and politicization that is a construction of an active citizenship. His ideas helps us to reject fatalists' ideas of determinism and stories of predetermination that cross the pedagogical debates and the contemporary politics, and helps us to say that human beings are not finished and there is always time and room for change, transformation, and the building of new practices, other ways of living, other power relationships, other realities, and another world. To go back to what we said at the beginning, the foundational work of OMEP includes the most important elements contained in Paulo Freire's ideas: participation, communication, humanization, transformation, and contextualization. We understand that all educational practice and all pedagogy reveals a political option. At OMEP, our commitment and our option is to help build an inclusive, equitative, and quality education for all since birth. For this reason, we say that education is a human right, and it is also a key tool to achieve all the other human rights and a catalyst to achieve all the sustainable development goals. Paulo Freire is alive in each and every one of us. He taught us, and he is still teaching us, that education on its own cannot change the world, but we have the trust and the hope that it will change the people that will change the world. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to our speakers, who we know have a lot of things in common. For example, one fundamental, that is to have known Paulo Freire, to be with him, talk with him, and enjoy his words. And we were speaking with Mercedes and thinking that we had this possibility by dialoguing with his written word that is made alive, and it's reread and relived each time that we come by his books and all of his legacy. We're going to continue now with our next speaker, who is Carlos Calvo. He studied at Stanford University in the United States, where he graduated as an educational anthropologist. He then continued his doctoral and postdoc studies in the same university in the 𝗽𝗿𝗃 Research Institute in Israel. He also holds a degree in philosophy from the Catholic University of Valparaíso in Chile. He currently works as an academic at the University of La Serena and in the Abierta de Recoleta University in the Republic of Chile. Throughout his life, he worked as a teacher and researcher, and he has investigated the difference between education and schooling, as well as the way young children learn. These ideas have been taken up and studied in postgraduate programs in Latin America and have been researched in doctoral theses. Most of them are available online, as well as in his various conferences. We now give the floor to Carlos Calvo so he can talk to us about his wonderful experience with Paulo Freire. Carlos, the floor is yours. Good afternoon. Thank you very much to everyone who has invited me to participate in this dialogue about Paulo Freire's pedagogical thoughts linked to his thinking about liberty, that is a fundamental topic across all eras. Desireé already said it. I have always been a teacher, now I'm retired, and I have been influenced, like many people, by Paulo Freire, with a vision that is wonderful, I believe. I knew him during my first year of college, and at that time we created the first summer school programs, and we took thousands of university students to work in popular education in different sectors of the country. Just because I studied pedagogy, the president of the Students' Federation in 𝗣𝗂𝗶𝗿𝗄 University in Chile says, well, go and take a course with a Brazilian person who is Exile, who has a very particular method, something like that. So I went from Valparaíso to Santiago, that were 3 hours by bus, together with a girl who studied to be a professor as well. And so we went to his office. He welcomed us very warmly, and I loved listening to him talking Portuguese and Spanish, this portuñol. I had never heard any Portuguese apart from the World Cup one time, and so I met him, and he was young for me. At that time, I couldn't figure out how old he was, and he was talking to us in portuñol, and I was already dazzled. But when to that sound he added the content, it was absolutely outstanding. At home, I had learned to respect everyone because we are all the same, but he said that everyone has culture, and he presents arguments and why education has to come from the other, from their life and their context. And a person that could be illiterate, what he has to do to gain literacy is to gain awareness of the reading that he does every day of his life. And Freire developed this idea, and he says that the educator is also an educatee, and I was very surprised by that the student is also the teacher. This was very surprising to me, because that means that I as a student can teach something to my teacher, and that my teacher, my educator, is also a person that does not know everything, but does not ignore everything either. Freire opens up a whole world which was fascinating to me. We go back to Valparaíso and we start training other young people. We teach them how to literate other people without having been through that experience. We started with these summer programs, which was wonderful because we traveled 24 hours up to Puerto Montt, living with other young boys and girls. It was amazing, and we taught, we had a great time. We were hungry, we were cold, but we had a great deal of fun. We were playing and starting to know these peasants that scolded us for trying to imitate them. And they told us, you have to be yourselves. This was a great slap in the face, because this person were telling us very kindly, why are you talking like that, like us? And so little by little we started to learn this new method that was very enriching. When the summer program ended, we went back to Paulo Freire to tell him what and how we did, and he grabs his head in his hand and he says, but you did everything wrong. We had made a great mistake, but we did it with such enthusiasm that we were happy anyways. And so this was another teaching. He laughed at us. He didn't hide that we made a mistake. The good thing was that he was still laughing, but not being overly serious, but with the exact amount of seriousness. He lifted us up so we wouldn't feel bad. We were very touched by this because we felt bad, and it was even worse. But then he said, this doesn't matter. We did it, we made a mistake, but it didn't matter. Not so that we would do it again, but because it had already been done. And so now we had to make things better. This was a beautiful teaching for a young man who had finished his first year at a university and who was starting to understand how I needed to be as a teacher. My love and my passion for teaching started here because I started studying philosophy because I wasn't accepted in the psychology school in Santiago. So I was going to spend a year training to be a psychologist, but Freire made me discover that my passion was in teaching. Now I had to discover what kind of a teacher I had to do, but I wanted to find this. But then something strange happened with Freire. I soaked up all his knowledge, I read all his books, and after that, when I go to do my postdoc, I noticed that I do very well quoting Paulo Freire, and even more so when I could give examples of first-hand experiences. And at that moment, I became worried. And so I decided not to read Paulo Freire again, who was an internationally recognized man. He had been at Harvard, he was going to Geneva. However, one time I wrote to him so that he would help me find a topic for my thesis, and he answered. He said, "My dear Carlos, I remember, I sadly don't know where that letter is. I must have it saved somewhere, but I don't know where. I would need to locate it, but it's somewhere there." But the thing is that I don't read Freire, and I'm very sorry to say this, because I was fed up with Freire, because everything could be explained through him. And so at that moment I said, but where am I? What is it that I am thinking? So I don't read him anymore, and when I said anymore, I was really done with it. Of course, I knew him because in my area everyone was talking about him. When I go to Mexico, I work with education for Latin America. I go to work with native populations. And so at that moment we suggested invited Freire and Ivan Illich, and he said why, so that they can talk among them, to be a week together. And so what are they going to talk about? Well, we said, well, they are probably going to talk about education. Sadly, they weren't invited, and so I continued not reading Freire. Many years later, in Valencia, España, I felt the urge to read Freire again when I started listening to some Freireans talking about him. And do you know what I found? I found that by separating myself intentionally from the teacher, I hadn't stopped being a Freirean myself. It was an amazing finding. I started going through a different area studying education. I knew other education systems in the world. I tried to develop my own critical thinking, separating education as a process from the schooling process in our educational institutions. And when I reread Freire, I realized that I am still Freirean, and so I understood the Buddhist principle that the disciple has to kill the Buddha. I wrote an article about all of these findings, and then another one where I reflect upon what would have happened if Paulo Freire had been my student and not the other way around. I, as a teacher of Paulo Freire. And when I thought about this, I was embarrassed because I said, well, but how can I say something like this? But I developed this idea because it's interesting. If we are teachers teaching and learning, so how would I teach something to Freire? I don't know what would have happened. Maybe we wouldn't have had the great Paulo Freire, who knows? But it did a great deal of good to me to know that I studied thanks to my family, my context, and without a doubt, thanks to Freire and other people, I learned in freedom and not in the appearance of freedom. And this is something fascinating to me, honestly, because freedom implies risks. But because it is in freedom, we must assume a commitment, and therefore one is responsible for their own actions. And so I cannot blame the system, even though it might have blame. I can't blame my students, although they might be to blame, but rather I have to be responsible for my own actions. And so, for that reason, in my classes to psychology students, I told them that if they wanted to be good teachers, they had to know that they would be risking their own job safety all the time, because the system generally doesn't like having good professionals. They prefer people who reiterate content but are void of life, rather than a person that helps another person continue with their critical thinking. These ideas helped me a lot to do a lot of research together with Desireé on childhood and researching the capacity of children to learn and knowing that children do not need to go to school to be taught how to think, because they can already think perfectly well. This is not a merit of anyone, as it is not a merit for us to walk if we have legs. This is not a merit in itself. We have the ability, the innate ability to walk, and we have the same innate ability to learn. So what do we need to do at school? We need to enable that this strength is maximized and enable people to generate bonds, the new with the old, and link all of this, the old with the history, and the new is what is being introduced into this context. This is why education cannot be left out of the context, but education at school can be void of context. And in fact, it is very frequent that if you ask, and I could do it here, if you ask a group of people to name 5 animals, wild animals, they will very probably mention lion, elephant, tiger, etc., and not the native animals of our land. Schooling puts the subject facing a world that isn't their own, but the subject is not taught to discover its own content. And that's why I believe that the curriculum in each school has to be the context, the social, historical context where that school is located. We need to know the flora and the fauna of that place. If we can learn that properly, if we can categorize it, then we can extrapolate. What's the difference between the Seine and the native rivers of La Serena, Chile? None, because both of them are rivers. Well, you could say, well, because one is in France, but the other one is in La Serena, and it doesn't seem like a lot, but it seems that because the native one has been denied its history, but we learn the history of the other one. So if the curriculum can focus on the local, in the local we will find the universal, because the local bears the mark of the universal. It is the yin and the yang. So in this way, we simplify the teaching process and the learning process, because children, especially in primary education, are learning how to name according to their context. What are the trees that you see around you on the street? The one that grows in the cracks of the cement, what's the name of that weed? I'm embarrassed to say that I don't know their name, and I've walked by them for 75 years and I still don't know their name. I see trees around and I still don't know their names. Maybe some of them I'm not so ignorant, but you understand my point. The same with the sea. I have lived in front of the Pacific for most of my life, and I can't describe what is a mere 100 meters inside the coast. What are the fish? What algae? All the sea life, I don't know their names. Of course, if you ask me, I may know some of their names, but it's not a systematic knowledge. Carlos, please, if you can conclude now. Yes, okay. So, if we know the local, it is easy for us to extrapolate to the universal, because the scale is going to be exactly the same. There is not a river in the world that does not have the same structure as the rest of the rivers. The structure of the rivers is also the same as our respiratory or circulatory system. It is the same. Education, therefore, ends up being a process of rooting ourselves in the context in which we live. And this enables me in a feedback process to continue to discover my reality. In this way, Freire's work and his legacy is always going to be current. It's a classic. While a man is reading Freire, he's going to learn something, just as we can read any classic of any time. Thank you very much. Thank you, Carlos, so much. It's a pity to have to cut these conversations short because they're so interesting, but we know that we have limited time. And yes, and you know, it's better to be cut off because you get the feeling that it was interesting, and that's better than to have a feeling of boring people. Yes, of course, it's a pity to have to cut the very interesting conversation short. But well, we're going to give the floor now to Roberto. He's going to complement what we have been saying about childhood and education, and of course Paulo Freire's legacy. So now I'm going to give the floor to Roberto Mauro Gurgel Rocha. He is the Vice President of OMEP Brazil. He is the Vice President of the State Education Council of Maranhão. He is an agricultural engineer and sociologist, a university professor at the Federal University of Maranhão, environmentalist, social activist for childhood, and he is also a national coordinator for the university extension. He has published 20 books, and he's currently a member of the State Forum for Environmental Education and the Justice and Peace Foundation of Igreja. He participates in the Global Education Pact launched by Pope Francis. Roberto, you have the same time as Carlos, more or less 15 to 20 minutes. We're going to ask you to talk as slow as you can. We know that you speak Portuñol, so that we can understand, and also for our interpreters, please, if you can talk just a little bit slower. Go ahead, Roberto. Thank you. Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you, Mercedes, Carlos Calvo, for sharing his experience, to Desireé for coordinating, and I will try to keep my presentation in time. First, I would like to clarify that I'm going to speak Portuñol. I liked when Carlos mentioned that Freire spoke Portuñol, because I also speak the same kind of dialect. And I also wanted to clarify that I am not a pedagogist. I am an agronomer, a sociologist. I have lived in Israel. I studied there too, and so we have some things in common. However, my story with Paulo Freire begins in my youth, when I was at university in my first years to study agronomy, and I was an activist in the Catholic youth, a group of the church, and Paulo Freire was one of the people who guided us. He had a very strong Catholic training, and he had very strong experiences related to this. We had a very interesting first conversation because we were in a meeting and someone came and told us that some of the students had to share a bed to leave one bed empty for a new professor who was coming. Nobody knew who this professor was, and after a sleepless night, because the beds were very uncomfortable, I went to the yard in the campus and I met this professor there. This professor was very warm, very kind. He hadn't slept and he asked me, "Young man, what's your name?" After that, he really wanted to learn everything about me. And after I had spoken for about an hour, he says, "Well, okay, now I'm going to speak for a moment," and he told me some anecdotes. That was my first contact with Paulo Freire. So, for you to understand better the figure of Paulo Freire, I think that we need to know the context of the Northeast in that time where he began with his work. This is one of the poorest and warmest regions in Brazil. Here we have the phenomenon of the drought. I was born here in the Northeast. I was born in Ceará, that is a state in Brazil. We have a terrible history of hunger, and I think that because of that, we all have the desire to fight against social injustice. That was a time when Paulo Freire began with his work. We had a very strong influence of national development, and because of that, we had the hope for change in the region, to get out of a purely assistentialist politic to a different kind of politics. At that moment, we were all involved in different kinds of activities with the national students' movement. We planned cultural activities, a lot of them, and Paulo Freire was one of the people who guided us. These activities worked in the context of the church groups. He and Paulo Freire had a very strong influence from many figures in this context, in particular one called Joseph Livre, who was a French priest who was here in the Northeast and had a very important role in the development of the region. We read many things, and because of the affinity that Paulo Freire had with us, he participated in the social movement, in particular in the rural area, and we had there a person who was very influential, who was 𝗍𝗲𝗏𝗏, an archbishop who had a very important social role in the whole of Brazil. So at that moment, we already had a very strong influence of the theology of liberation. We participated in left-hand groups in the rural areas, and this gave this particular touch to the Northeast region. I speak very from the heart of this region, and today in particular because we are commemorating the National Day of the Northeast in Brazil. Paulo Freire had many influences at that time because of living in a very poor region and also because of his own story. He was born poor. He was born when his father was at hospital, and that's why his mother says that he almost hadn't known his father because he was in the brink of death. However, his father finally passed away when he was just a kid, around 12 or 13 years old. So this was the story of Paulo Freire, and I think that the poor can relate to his story because he suffered the same. And there's a book, I don't know if you know it, called The Pedagogy of the Possible Dreams. This is a book, and here Paulo Freire tells a very interesting story called The Hen and Captain Themistocles' Children. He was his father, and in a certain moment he says that he and his brothers were very hungry. They hadn't eaten for several days, and in front of his house they saw a hen. They look at it and they wonder what to do. So they took it, they strangled it, and at that moment the hen became lunch. This is very interesting because his mother at this moment in the text says the following: she was faced with a very difficult choice, with a dilemma, like many other families at that time. The dilemma was between peace of conscience or a hen and a full stomach. So the sacrifice of the hen created a problem in his mother's conscience, but fed all of her children. This is why I believe that Freire's story is very influenced because of all of these things. And it's important to remember also his professional training. He's not a pedagogist, he's a lawyer. But what happened was that he had the opportunity to do some work for an important figure who was working against a poor person. From that moment on, he stepped aside from his profession because he said that he could not work in an institution that worked against poor people. So he went on to work in a different area, and at that time he began to produce his first works on education. Here I have the pleasure of saying that his first experiences on education were here in the University of Recife, and it gave birth to the extension that carries his name, the University Extension. So his work, his method, was born from an experience in the University Extension in Recife. I met him at this moment because the students walked along with him through this experience. He had also the experience of working in Rio Grande do Norte, another state in Brazil, and he also worked in Pernambuco because at that moment we had President João Goulart. He was a president that had a certain social vision, a bit left-handed, but he started doing many fundamental changes, and this gave Freire the opportunity to have a great impact in the Northeast. He created a literacy plan, a national literacy plan, and this was after the state attack in Brazil in 1974. So I think you all know what happened when Paulo Freire was in exile. He went to Bolivia, Chile, other countries, and of course this exile was sad, but it was also very productive because at that moment he learned the situation of becoming an international citizen, and he gained a world vision because he assumed this condition of being a world citizen. I would like to take a moment now to tell another story that I had with Paulo Freire. This was when he was at jail. I lived in Recife, I studied there too, and we always went to a beach. Sorry, Roberto, if you could speak a little bit slower, please. Yes, I am trying. So I was saying that we always went to the beach there. We went with two girls who always left when 12 o'clock at midday came. And so we started to wonder what was going on, and I asked one of them, why do you always leave at 12? Yes, but we couldn't understand why. And they said that they went to visit their father. So I asked if he was at hospital, and they said no, he's in jail. I asked for his name, and they said his name is Paulo Freire. So I remembered the first time that I met him when he was in freedom in Ceará, and now I learned the news that he had continued with his career, but from prison. At this moment, I would like to tell you that the contact that I had with him and his family, I discovered a very original personality. He was a very humble person. He was a person that liked feeling and listening. He preferred listening rather than talking. He enjoyed dialogue, and the people who dialogued with him, they knew that they were at ease talking to him, but they also liked letting him talk. From all the talks that we had, I started to learn a little bit more about his work. I was very influenced by the education as a practice of freedom. Even if I wasn't trained in pedagogy, I believe that I always believed in education. I never liked a purely transmissive type of education that is the most common type that we have here in Brazil. We have the typical classrooms where you have many people sitting down, listening quietly while one person is talking. This is a practice that I was very uncomfortable with, so I became closer with education as a practice of freedom, and then I also became closer to the pedagogy of the alternance. And in fact, Paulo Freire dedicated pedagogy of the oppressed to these oppressed people. So, in the sense of the work that we did in education for the masses, I remember that I started to know the method of Paulo Freire, and so we decided to have an experience in Ceará. This is something that we had learned in agronomy, and so we went to work in a community and we planted some seeds there. But when the plants grew, we discovered that the variety of the plant was a different one than the one we expected. So at that moment we didn't know what to do. The same as with Carlos, that he said that the mistake is always a learning opportunity. From that moment, I became closer to Paulo Freire's methodology, because as he was poor, he was committed to the pedagogy of the oppressed, and he was committed to working for the poorest, because it wasn't something different from his story. It was a reaction to what he had suffered in his childhood. At this point, I think that I revised a little bit of the history, and now I would like to tell you something about our own academic dialogue. As it was mentioned already in my bio, I work in the university, and I decide at a national level I coordinate the extension activities in the Ministry of Education. When Paulo Freire was in exile, he produced the text Extension and Communication that is translated here in Brazil, where he talked about the rural areas, and he worked on a pedagogy that was purely transmissive, like a package pedagogy for farmers. So in the ministry, we also had the influence of other authors that worked on these topics, and so we applied Paulo Freire's method, and we had the liberty of applying this method at a national level in the extension without any problems with the government, even in a period of a coup d'etat. So I have the pleasure of saying that I had one of the best experiences that had a great repercussion as regards the university extension in Brazil. Roberto, just to sum up, please. Okay, so I wanted to say that I produced this work where I tried to recreate the Freirean thinking that is an extension of the book by Freire, and I wrote University Extension, Communication or Domestication. So I'm very glad to say that the book had a great repercussion, and I felt very humbled by this. Paulo Freire read my book, and in a meeting he talked to me about it and about the possibility of communication to create something building on what I had learned with him. And so I'm very happy to say that today, in the commemoration of 100 years of Paulo Freire, I am the state coordinator of the commemoration in reference to Freire's thinking, and I am also articulating with the Paulo Freire Institute in Brazil. So thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm very sorry again for the portuñol, and thank you for all the experiences shared today. Thank you very much. Thank you, Roberto, very much. Thank you for all the experiences that you have shared and for your portuñol. It was very clear, I must say. It wasn't difficult to follow you, so thank you very much. So time has flown by. We are already past our time. It was so much fun, and of course the idea is that we will meet again to continue to work on these topics. I say goodbye now, and I leave you with Mercedes so that she can give a closing speech on this seminar. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Desireé. Thank you very much, Carlos, Roberto. It has really been a pleasure to share this afternoon in Buenos Aires, and who knows what times our colleagues are. I want to thank very much for the participation of our colleagues who are present at the seminar. I want to go back to something I said that was reaffirmed for both our special guests, Carlos and Roberto. The fundamental elements contained in Freire's thought that we also try to consistently reflect in the work of OMEP. Participation, communication, humanization, transformation, and contextualization. I believe that these are absolutely key elements that are part of the ethics of where we have to stop, and we stop, and we do something that I have often said from Freire. Freire said that every day we must make an effort of coherence, because coherence is not given. Every day we debate, we are immersed in these tensions that the context presents us: political, economic, social tensions, the health crisis. So that effort of coherence, that effort to do what we think, to do what we would believe, for all this to coincide is not easy, but it must be done together with others. It is easier to make it together. I once again thank OMEP Argentina, because I could not be the president of OMEP without the colleagues of OMEP Argentina, nor could I be president of OMEP without the support of all Latin America that support me, and of colleagues from other regions, such as OMEP France, Canada, so many countries. This wonderful meeting that we are having with Africa, and valuing the knowledge, work, commitment, and pedagogical development that each of our countries contribute to improve quality, to work better with children, to expand access to early childhood education in the entire world. This day is really a pride for us. I am very happy to have shared with everyone, and I strongly invite you to continue participating, to continue committing, to continue communicating, thinking that education is humanization. It is the possibility of transformation, and that this must be done from our human coordinates, from where we are, from our cultures, which are all rich. There is no better and worse. There are all enormously rich, and we all form a huge and precious kaleidoscope that I hope will be a cradle for childhood all around the world. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias a todos y todos.
Thank you, everyone.
Paulo Freire.